All right. Um, yeah, good morning, everyone. So, yeah, I've been reading Pascal, if you guys can't tell. Um, I'm really loving Pascal recently, and I've been reading his penses. I don't know if it's penses or penses. I'm pretty sure it's penses because it's supposed to be like in Spanish, like piensa. Piensa. Okay. Anyways, um, yeah, so some of the things that I've noticed kind of does some concern about Pascal's wager is that Pascal's wager, in my opinion, has mainly been placed in this Christian apologetic area, right? We've confined Pascal's wager to just this Christian apologetics. Now, I don't think that it should have ever been in a kind of Christian apologetics. I mean, obviously, Pascal is, a, supposedly a proclaimed Catholic and so on. But Pascal, he's he understands that you can't really prove God per se, and so that's why he presents this wager, right? And it's interesting in his book um, that he discovers that you have to kind of wager first before you can prove anything, which I don't think a lot of people pay attention to this movement, because the way our society is structured today is that they want to be proven something first and then they'll kind of give to it, right? They'll throw their stakes at it, right? As long as you can prove to them in some manner, some form, they're willing to give themselves to whatever you prove it to be. But Pascal is doing this movement where he's saying, actually, you have to wager first, and then I can prove to you. I really, I don't think there's been enough attention on this movement of the way the epistemology is going, at least in Pascal for this section, because there seems to be this notion that you have to risk something in order to believe the proof, in order to be proven, in order to encounter the proof. I think that's a better way to frame it actually. That you have to wager first and then encounter the proof or possibly encounter the proof. Um, so yeah, there's a lot to say. I really have a lot to say on Pascal, but there's so much to say that it kind of like paralyzes me a little bit. Um, but let's just begin with not necessarily with the wager, but there's some elements in the section of where Pascal begins to introduce the wager in the penses um, that we can explore a little bit. Some of the context behind the wager is that Pascal is trying to make this argument that one, you can't really know if God exists or does not exist, right? And there's also this possibility that you can, um, there's also this possibility that you can seek God and never know who God is. Um, And Pascal actually does this interesting argument where he talks about numbers and how even though you know numbers in some sense, right, you don't know the nature of numbers. And so he says just because you add a unit to another unit doesn't mean that you actually know its nature, right? And so he's saying that it's actually kind of false to say that the number is even, and it's also false to say that the number is odd. And it's due to this thing, this addition or subtraction or whatever end result of odd or even. Pascal is basically saying, at least from the way I understood it, is that it's still a number and you still know nothing about it. You still know nothing about its nature. All you know is that it's a number. And so Pascal basically uses this example of numbers by, either adding a unit that you can essentially know something, you can know something exists without knowing its nature, without really knowing what it is. So that's one of the examples that I found pretty intriguing. For me, this is pretty intuitive, mainly because if I feel like if you're accustomed to philosophical thinking, um, I think philosophical thinking is just kind of proof of this, right? That we know these things exist, and yet we realize that we don't really know their nature. So it does seem really parallel. Again, it seems really intuitive for Pascal to argue from that point. But I know for people that don't typically have, you could say, philosophical reflections of this sort, um, they may find it a little bit kind of weird that Pascal is proposing this argument, saying that you don't know the nature of numbers or something. Um, like I could just hear somebody say, "What does he mean? You don't know the nature of a number? The number is just a number, right?" Um, but yeah, I find the arguments preceding to the wager relatively fascinating. Something that I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about. Now, this next argument, I'm surprised isn't told as often as the wager. Mainly because kind of I started thinking about what Pascal was saying, and I'm actually surprised about the force of this argument that he is presenting to us. And Pascal, he goes, I really like the way he begins this. He goes, "What's easier, to begin life or to be raised from the dead?" Right? And so he kind of says this in a kind of obviously, I guess, I don't know, sarcastic. It's not really a question that's supposed to be answered, but because he's gonna give you the answer. Um, and Pascal says, he gives a couple examples. He says, can a hen give birth without a a rooster? Right? Can a hen give birth without a rooster? Can a virgin have a baby without the male? And what you realize that Pascal is trying to get is that he starts to conclude with these questions that actually it's harder to produce life than it is to reproduce life. And when you re examine the argument about which is more difficult to produce life or to be raised again from the dead, Pascal seems to be drawing this parallel with death as a kind of reproduction of life, that it's infinitely more difficult to just produce life from a void when in all of reality all there is just kind of like a reproduction of things, right? We have the splitting of our cells, things die and then come back, and things die and come back, right? um, and so Pascal is kind of making this argument with death. He's almost equating death with reproduction, with this kind of reproducing, this kind of duplication of life. Um, well, I wouldn't say death that way, but I would say being born again or raising from the dead. That is a kind of duplication, but you could say death. I would say death. It would be like that, um, for Pascal. Um, and so the argument that really he's trying to make here is that it's hard to produce anything without relation to something else. That's his main argument, right? So he's what he's trying to say is actually he kind of flops the argument on its head. He's saying, why are you he he's saying, why are you finding it difficult that you can't be raised from the dead? When you really think about it, it's actually more difficult to be brought into life than to be raised from the dead, right? And of course, what he means by being brought into life, he's talking about this ex ex nihilo kind of movement, right? Ex nihilo kind of movement where you get born into life from nothing, essentially, right? The universe just kind of just pops in. Um, but he's saying that it's really almost impossible to imagine producing something without it needing its relation to something else. So this is really what he means by giving birth to something. And that's why he's challenging. He's like, you really think it's that impossible that you can't be raised from the dead, when it seems almost more impossible to give birth to something without it having some relation to something else, meaning reproduction, right? Reproduction needs two and some otherness in some form, right? It needs some otherness, some presence of the other. Let's just put it that way. Um, so yeah, I find that argument really interesting when thinking and discussing Pascal. And then finally, we get to the wager, but I'm only going to talk about certain elements of the wager. One of the things that I've noticed that kind of does harm to Pascal's wager is this notion that it's just the common interpretation that there's nothing to lose. And even though Pascal says that, like verbatim, at least in the English translation, that, yeah, there's nothing to lose. Well, the reason why Pascal says, and if you, for those that haven't read the Pensives, I would definitely read this section on Pascal's wager. Read it again, um, and if you've read it before, I would encourage you to read it again. Mainly because what I find in Pascal's wager is that Pascal is he's doing this weird maneuver with nothingness, where he's saying, look, okay, the reason why there's nothing to lose is because you already you already are in some state, you already are in some sense in a state of nothingness. And the way Pascal kind of views this is that one, we can't be certain about anything. So the only thing that we can be certain about is nothingness. All right. So I'm going to kind of like I'm going to try to connect the dots because it's actually way more complicated or a little bit more complex in trying to understand what Pascal is saying when he's saying that there's nothing to lose. Because remember, for Pascal, nothing is certain. So that means we can only be certain about nothing, right? Which means that if we can only be certain about nothing, then the only thing that we have to lose is that nothingness. You see how like you see how that kind of gives an illusion of a safe bet, but it's not entirely a safe bet in a sense, mainly because we can argue this from a sort of inversion of itself, right? And Pascal kind of gives you a hint of this, right? One, the wager isn't optional, which is kind of how it gets presented in Christian apologetics. Um, the wagering is optional, but the wagering really isn't optional for Pascal. You have to choose. And it's certain that with everything you do, um, it's a risk. So it's one. It's certain that you have a risk. One, you're in this game. You have to wager, and you have to risk. That those are the certain things. Those are the certainties that are for sure certain, right? Those seem to be the three certainties, right? One, that we're certain about nothing. Two, that we're always waging. Three, for some reason I blanked out. um, I know I just said it, but oh yeah, that it's a risk, right? It's certain that it's a risk. So why would Pascal say there's nothing to lose, and yet somehow along that section of the wager he says, oh yeah, but it's certain that it's a risk. Why would he say that? Well, I think the way Pascal is thinking about risk is that he's thinking it from what you could gain and not what you could necessarily lose. Because remember, for Pascal, you lose nothing, right? But in a weird way, you're kind of in this nothingness, right? We're certain about nothing. We don't really know if God exists or doesn't exist. Um, and yet we lose nothing, right? But I wish if I could rephrase Pascal's you lose nothing, I would say you have a chance at losing nothingness. Um, you have a chance of losing nothingness. And this chance of losing nothingness means the possibility of gaining something. So that's actually the real risk. That's the real risk. Well, yeah, that's the real risk for Pascal, right? Is that there is this possibility of you gaining something from the nothing. But you can't gain anything from the nothing if you never wager, if you never um, take a risk. And already we have to wager. So not wagering is already not an option. So what Pascal is actually saying is that risk is already there. You have to wager, and it's this choice between nothingness and infinity, right? This infinite something else, right? So there seems to be two sides here. There's like that infinite nothing, and then there's this infinite to gain. And so, but here's the notion of the safe bet that I want to play on, because Pascal does say there's nothing to lose. Um, but I want to play on this notion of the safe bet. The safe bet is, yeah, a safe bet is true that there is nothing to lose. But a safe bet isn't the way we understand the safe bet isn't the same way that Pascal is understanding it. So, for example, if you decide to gamble something, you typically try to calculate how little you can give for the possibility of how much you can gain, right? You're like, okay, I'll bet like $10 and see if I can win like 40, right? The thing about that, the thing about what Pascal is saying is that that bet, you betting on 10 is something you already decided to lose, right? You're like okay with losing $10 for the possibility of gaining 30, right? What you're probably not okay with is betting everything, um, because you could possibly lose everything. But what Pascal is saying is that that actually makes no difference. Now, monetarily, yeah, that's a huge difference, right? That's the difference between, you know, basically being able to pay your car payments and not being able to pay your car payments. It's a huge difference, right? So a safe bet in a kind of, mundane matters, really does matter, right? But but Pascal's not thinking about that. He's not thinking about our sort of. I mean, there's an argument to say that there is, but it's in a different manner. For the most part, Pascal is not occupied with the trifling activities of what we do with our everyday life, right? Is it a safe bet that I go with the apple versus the banana? What are the pros and cons? Pascal's not talking about those kind of safe bets, and trying to figure out what you could possibly, you know, not lose from this. What Pascal is trying to get at is something way more existential. He wants us to think he wants us to think a couple of things. And here's what we're certain on. So he adds another fourth thing that we're certain about. Remember, so one, so let's just recap the couple of things that Pascal says that we're absolutely certain of. One, we're certain that we know nothing. We're certain that we're not certain of anything, right? The second certainty is that we have to wager. We have to make a choice. The third certainty is that it's always a risk. The fourth certainty, death. It means we're going to die. We all know for certain we will die. So What Pascal is setting us up for is to look at all these certainties and knowing that the ultimate certainty is death. He's saying that why not risk what you know for certain against something uncertain? Why not? Because the ultimate certainty is your annihilation, right? Is just your annihilation at this point. So we all know that it ends in our annihilation. But what Pascal is trying to bring up to us is that, okay, so what? We all that we know are these certainties that we can't be certain about anything, that we have to choose, that um, we have to take risks, and that it ends in our death. And so it seems like what Pascal is trying to show us is that we already start with, in some sense, a bad hand. We start with a bad hand. Why do we start with a bad hand? Um, Obviously, this has Christian roots, which you will kind of see later on in the Pensees. We talked about human nature and everything else. But yeah, okay. So now that we've discussed the four certainties within Pascal's wager, Pascal says this really interesting line that I want to share with you guys. He says that it's all divided. He says, wherever the infinite is, there is not an infinity of chances of loss against that of gain. There is no time to hesitate. You must give all. And thus, when one is forced to play, he must renounce reason to preserve his life rather than risk it for infinite gain, as likely to happen as the loss of nothingness. And so he actually uses, I can't believe, actually, yeah, he does actually use nothingness in this quote. And then he kind of follows it up with, for it is no use to say it is uncertain if we will gain, and it is certain that we risk, and that the infinite distance between the certainty of what is staked and the uncertainty of what will be gained equals the finite good, which is certainly staked against the uncertain infinite. Okay, so there's a lot of confusing kind of entanglements there, but I want to just relook at this statement where he says, it's all divided. Wherever the infinite is, there is not an infinity of chances of loss against that of gain. Okay, so why isn't there an infinite amount of losses in comparison to gain? This goes back to the four certainties that I kind of labeled out with Pascal. If death is for certain, right? If we know death is for certain, that means that our life is finite. That means that in our finite life, we can only lose a finite amount of times. That's what Pascal is showing us. So that means that, for example, if you're a gambler and you decide to just gamble all your money, yeah, you lose. You could lose everything, and you could end up homeless. But what Pascal is actually saying in this is that, well, you would be homeless for just a finite amount because eventually you die, right? And when you die, you're no longer homeless. And the same thing with everything else that we tend to lose in life is that it would be finite. The reason why it would be finite is because your life is finite. You end up dying. So your losses is always going to be finite. And so if your losses are always going to be finite, what Pascal is trying to bring to us and show us is that from this point, because we only have finite losses available to us because of our because of our finite lives, that means we have an infinite to gain. And what is this infinite to gain? Obviously, it's God for Pascal. But I want to just kind of for a moment detach Pascal's wager from its his notion of God. I just want to momentarily detach this because I want to show why Pascal's argument is strong, not in the Christian apologetic sense, but really strong philosophically. It's super strong philosophically. The thing that's strong about Pascal's argument is that he's trying to show us that everything seems to result in this return to nothingness. Why? Because one, we end up finding out that our reasoning and our thinking is limited, that we can't really be certain about anything, that we're certain about nothing. That's what we can be certain about, that we're certain of nothing, and that we're certain of death, which is also a kind of nothingness. And so with this looming return to nothingness and this sort of residual of always nothingness around us, because we can't be certain about anything. Our death is finite. We're going to die and sort of remain in this nothingness. What Pascal is saying is that if you're already in this nothingness, why don't you wager this nothingness against the uncertainty that it could be something else? And I like this detachment away from God for just a moment, because it really shows the significance of what Pascal is trying to say. Because what he's trying to tell you is that remember the first risk that I told you about, that nothing is certain. This follows back into the certainty about your death. That it's possible that even your death, even though you know for sure you're going to die, it's not certain that the death is permanent, right? And so with this, Pascal is trying to show us that the nothingness that threatens us, right? Death, the limits of our reason, the limits of our cognitive abilities, the sort of nothingness that always hangs over us. What he's trying to say is, why not wager that? Why not wager that nothingness? Because it is nothing, and therefore, ironically, you have nothing to lose, right? Why not wager that and risk the possibility of discovering that that nothing could actually be something? And to me, so far, this is my obviously I'm biased. My favorite, my this interpretation is my favorite interpretation, actually, um, because it it brings to a close examination of the fact that even though we have a finite life, Pascal is really trying to show you that this nothingness, you may not even know what this nothingness is, right? So why not stake it? Why not throw it into the possibility of its uncertainty and possibly gain something from it? It's, I would say, Pascal's wager is not really knowing what the cards you have in hand, right? I would say Pascal's wager is similar to somebody saying, pick a hand, right? It's similar to saying, you know, pick a hand and you could win a prize or you could not win a prize, right? But the idea of not winning a prize is, well, you already don't have the prize, right? Because you have to pick a hand. And if you don't, and if you do pick a hand and don't get the prize, well, then you were exactly where you were, right? You never had the prize. And so the way Pascal is presenting this is that he's trying to say, why not? You know, why remain in your nothingness when you could wage it? And only in that sense do you only ever have nothing to lose. Get it? Nothing to lose. That nothingness can be lost. And now you kind of get a similar understanding of, but actually the real loss that is present in Pascal's wager that isn't, almost, maybe I have to reread it again and again, but um, I want to say he doesn't even explicitly say this, but the real loss is not the chance of losing nothing. The real loss is the fact that you may never actually give a chance for the nothing to possibly be something else. And I feel like that's a lot of reflection to kind of give with Pascal's wager, that the nothing could be something. And if you never wager that nothing, you can never discover if it's something or if it's nothing. And only in that sense, if you wager, do you have the nothing to lose? All right. That's the end of my reflections. All right, guys, take care.